Hey guys, tonight we walk into foggy cobblestone alleys, past chimneys coughing smoke into a low gray sky, through puddles that reflect gaslight lanterns and black iron fences. We're in Victorian Britain, where absolutely everyone is tired, slightly damp, and on the verge of being diagnosed with something mysteriously vague. You're probably not going to survive this. Not because it's dangerous, but because by the end of it, you may find yourself voluntarily walking into cold rain like it's your new self-care routine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've barely stepped out the front door before your foot squelches into the edge of a puddle that definitely wasn't there yesterday. The fog is thick enough to chew. Your coat is too thin. And you can already feel the drizzle reaching, very slowly, for your socks. And yet, if you lived in Victorian London, your physician might be delighted. You're not just catching a chill, they'd say. You're participating in a therapeutic walk. One that could help realign your nervous system, balance your mental faculties, and potentially correct your moral compass, all in a single damp afternoon. Welcome to the bizarrely soggy world of Victorian medicine. See, the mid-1800s in Britain weren't just about corsets and cholera. They were also about overwhelm. The country was industrializing at a ridiculous pace: factories, steamships, telegrams. Noise, soot, motion. Everything was clanging, spinning, steaming, and somehow speeding up all the time. And the people? They were falling apart. Doctors began to report a surge of ailments they couldn't pin down with thermometers or tongue depressors. People were fainting for no reason. Complaining of exhaustion. Insomnia. Weakness. A sense of dread that nothing meant anything and everything was moving too fast. Sound familiar? Historians still argue whether this spike in cases was biological, cultural, or just the natural result of people suddenly having too many responsibilities and not enough places to scream about it. But regardless of the cause, the result was clear: an epidemic of being, not quite ill, but definitely not well. If you went to the doctor in 1850 and said, "I feel anxious, tired, distracted, overwhelmed," you'd probably be told you had neurasthenia. Or nervous exhaustion. It was a diagnosis with almost no diagnostic criteria. Like the medical equivalent of shrugging while writing a prescription. But the Victorians loved naming things, especially when those things sounded vaguely Greek and vaguely serious. So neurasthenia became the catch-all condition of the era. Rich? Neurasthenia. Poor? Neurasthenia. Too much reading? Definitely neurasthenia. Refused to get married and inherited a dog instead? That was practically a textbook case. And the treatments? Well, they ranged from the mildly odd to the deeply concerning. Some doctors recommended ice baths. Others suggested milk-only diets. Some reached for the tried-and-true tools of leeches, electric shock therapy, or therapeutic naps that lasted most of the day. But then, a few doctors, especially those of the fresh air and virtuous suffering persuasion, began to recommend something simpler. Walk. Walk far. Walk long. Walk in the rain. Not just because it was cheaper than therapy, though it certainly was. But because the rain itself, they believed, was part of the cure. There was something about it, the feel of cold drops on your face, the bite of wind across your cheeks, the relentless forward motion despite discomfort, that felt morally correct. A kind of penance, but in tasteful outerwear. This wasn't a walk meant for joy or leisure. It was not the sun-dappled stroll of poets or the quaint promenade of Jane Austen heroines. No. This was the trudge of the righteous sufferer. The damp pilgrimage of the soul in search of clarity. You didn't just walk into the rain. You committed to it. In fact, many doctors insisted that to fully benefit from the experience, you must leave your umbrella at home. Why? Because umbrellas represented avoidance, weakness, a refusal to fully embrace the wet hand fate had dealt you. Rainwalking became more than medicine. It was philosophy, therapy, a quiet rebellion against the growing noise of modern life. Imagine it, you, in a long wool coat, boots squelching across the cobblestones of Hampstead Heath. Raindrops drip down your collar. The tips of your gloves are soaked. You pass another soul doing the exact same thing, nodding solemnly like, "Yes, friend, we are both drenched and deeply healed." One fringe theory even claimed that people who walked regularly in the rain developed a stronger mental spine, a kind of weatherproof resilience that allowed them to endure disappointment, bad news, and awkward social dinners without flinching. Mainstream science of the time, of course, didn't necessarily support these claims. But that didn't stop people from enthusiastically obeying them. Because in a society where discomfort was often equated with discipline, and discipline was the ultimate virtue, rainwalking just made sense. It was accessible, stoic, virtuous, and frankly, cheaper than another round of leech therapy. Some people took it further. They began keeping rain journals, writing poetic observations about the way wet slate gleamed under street lamps, about the scent of mud and iron, and how it reminded them of their own mortality in a somehow comforting way. Others just used it as an excuse to escape the expectations of their households for a few damp hours. And a few swore by it. Swore it cured their melancholy, their headaches, their listlessness. Whether it did or not, that's for you to decide. But as the rain begins to tap against your shoulders now, and you breathe in the chilled air of a London street just waking up, you begin to understand the appeal. The world is quieter here, wetter, colder, but also clearer. You walk on. Your boots are definitely soaked through now. It's the kind of wet that doesn't announce itself all at once. No, this dampness sneaks in. First, it's a chill against your toes. Then it's a squish in the heel. Eventually, your entire foot feels like it's been submerged in cold tea. Still, you keep walking. Because, whether you like it or not, you've just been diagnosed with something very Victorian. Neurasthenia. Back in the 19th century, that word meant everything and nothing at once. Doctors used it as a blanket explanation for anyone who seemed vaguely off. Overly tired? Neurasthenia. Too jittery? Neurasthenia. Suddenly can't stand your job, your spouse, or the sound of pianos? Neurasthenia. It was the ideal diagnosis in a world where everyone was overwhelmed but couldn't quite say why. Historians still argue whether the whole concept of neurasthenia was a genuine medical discovery or just a very long-winded way of saying, life is hard, and people are tired. Either way, Victorian doctors loved it. Coined around the 1860s and popularized by American neurologist George Beard, neurasthenia was thought to be a result of nervous exhaustion. Essentially, the nerves were seen as a finite resource, like a battery that could be drained by too much thinking, feeling, socializing, reading novels, or participating in the hustle and bustle of increasingly urban life. Think of it as the 19th century version of burnout, but with a Latin name and significantly more staring out of rain-streaked windows. It struck the upper and middle classes most often, partly because they had access to doctors. but also because, let's be honest, they were the ones being constantly told to do more, learn more, be more, while wearing 6 layers of wool and surviving on boiled cabbage. Doctors blamed everything. Urban noise, steam engines, Morse code, feminine overexcitement, even the increasing availability of newspapers. Apparently, the daily onslaught of ink-smudged columns was enough to send some readers into a spiral of melancholic listlessness. One London physician famously insisted that too much piano playing in girls could overstimulate the nerves and lead to fits of neurasthenic decline. Another claimed that reading novels in poorly ventilated rooms was a direct path to vital depletion. Naturally, Victorian women were diagnosed far more often than men. Because of course they were. Middle-class women, in particular, bore the brunt of this diagnosis. They were expected to maintain perfect households, raise emotionally repressed children, write thank-you notes in impeccable penmanship, and somehow avoid thinking too deeply or walking too briskly, all while wearing corsets that could probably deflect a cannonball. So when they inevitably collapsed into headaches, insomnia, chest palpitations, and general fogginess, the answer was obvious: neurasthenia. For men, the diagnosis was slightly more flattering. Male patients were often seen as victims of overwork. Their exhaustion was interpreted as the noble price of being too intelligent, too ambitious, too deeply philosophical. Poor things. One fringe doctor even suggested that men got neurasthenia from thinking about big ideas too intensely in libraries with poor insulation. So if you're cold and clever, apparently you were doomed. Treatment options ranged from the logical to the ludicrous. Some were prescribed complete bed rest for months. Others were encouraged to engage in electrotherapy, which is exactly what it sounds like and equally as concerning. But for those not deemed ill enough to require confinement, or too poor to afford it, there was the recommendation to walk outside, in nature, and, curiously often, in the rain. One medical pamphlet from the 1880s even insisted that a long walk on sodden ground under gray skies shall do more for the nerves than 100 tinctures. Rain, it turns out, was medicine. And not just because it got you out of the house. To these doctors, rain symbolized a return to the elemental. A cleansing force. Something that demanded surrender. You couldn't argue with rain. You couldn't control it. All you could do was walk through it, and maybe come out the other side feeling a little more alive. There was also a belief that damp air was good for the lungs. Moisture softened the harsh soot-filled dryness of city life. It was thought to counteract the grinding machinery of industrialism with something gentle and primal. Nature's little slap on the face. Even the cold had its charms. Cold weather forced the blood to circulate, which supposedly reawakened dormant energy centers in the body. Or so said Dr. J. K. Miles, whose entire career was based on the idea that fortitude is best built under drizzle. You trudge past a row of hedgerows now, the wet leaves brushing against your sleeves. The fog presses low over the fields beyond. A dog barks faintly in the distance. Maybe it, too, is undergoing a very dignified neurasthenic treatment. As odd as it sounds, some patients genuinely believe the walks helped. Not necessarily because of any medical science, but because they offered something desperately rare in Victorian life: solitude, stillness, and permission to feel without being rushed. One London woman wrote in her journal that her doctor's prescription of a daily constitutional through Kensington Gardens, regardless of weather, was the only thing keeping her from melting into complete emotional marmalade. Her words, not mine. There was something sacred, she said, in letting the rain run down her sleeves while the world went on bustling in the distance. Something healing in the discomfort. Today, we might call it mindfulness. Grounding. Mental rest. Back then, it was just a wet, windy walk. But it worked. Sometimes. You pause under an elm tree, droplets tapping steadily on your shoulders. The bark is slick beneath your hand. Everything smells of earth and moss and something like wet iron. And for the first time, you wonder if those Victorian doctors, quirks and all, might have understood something we've forgotten. Sometimes, it's not about solving the problem. Sometimes, it's about moving through it. Even if your socks are wet. You can't feel your left heel anymore, but don't worry, that just means the therapy is working. According to Victorian medical wisdom, numb extremities during a rain walk were a sign that your inner faculties were preparing for rebalance. Or at least, that's what Dr. Basil Penworthy claimed in his 1879 pamphlet on the curative influence of wet air upon the nervous temperament. A title that's about as thrilling as warm porridge, but wildly popular among genteel readers in search of answers for their persistent malaise. You squelch onward, the path ahead a long stretch of gravel, slick with puddles. It glimmers faintly in the gray light, more silver than mud now, almost beautiful in its gloom. A crow hops alongside the hedge. You nod at him like a fellow traveler on a very niche pilgrimage. This isn't just a walk anymore. It's restoration. The belief wasn't new by Victorian standards. You're walking in the footsteps of an older idea, one that saw nature as not just scenery, but medicine. The Romans did it with their baths, the medieval monks with their herb gardens. But the Victorians? They leaned all the way in. Rain was raw, unfiltered, and blessedly indifferent to social rank. It didn't care whether you were a lord, a seamstress, or someone who couldn't stop sighing into their tea. If you walked in the rain, you were participating in the same elemental therapy as everyone else. There was, curiously, a trend of doctors writing poems about this. Yes, actual, published verses. In medical journals. Some of them painfully earnest. One such poem, titled To the Rain Upon My Collarbone, begins with the line, Thou droplet sage, thou balm of skies / that doth restore my weary sighs. You're allowed to roll your eyes. Historians still argue whether this poetic impulse was part of an intentional softening of medical practice, or just the result of very bored men with access to publishing presses and no indoor hobbies. Either way, the writing was on the wall, or, more accurately, in the weather. Nature, especially in its less charming moods, had begun to be seen as not just spiritually nourishing, but physically reparative. And rain, glorious, inconvenient, cold-drenching rain, was at the center of it all. You pass a wooden bench now, its surface glossed with water. A plaque on it reads, Donated by Dr. Arthur Longley, proponent of dampness as divine. You smile. You could sit, but then again, Dr. Longley would almost certainly rise from the mud to chastise you for breaking the flow of your therapeutic stride. So on you go. The idea was this: rain cooled the overheated nervous system. It shocked the senses gently awake. It rinsed away the mental cobwebs spun by too much reading, too many opinions, too many softly repressed emotions. Doctors began prescribing walks in specific kinds of rain. Light drizzle for melancholia. Steady downpour for nervous fatigue. Cold mist for imbalances of the temperament. And there were rules. One must not hunch too deeply. Let the rain strike your chest, said one doctor, that your lungs may partake of its clarifying chill. Hoods were allowed in moderation, but a truly immersive experience required the rain to touch the skin somewhere, wrists, neck, scalp. Hence the popularity of the deliberately too short sleeve or the strategically loose bonnet. It was a small rebellion, a society obsessed with decorum and layers willingly exposing itself to the elements. Drenching one's petticoat was suddenly fashionable, provided you did it in the name of health. You stop to observe a group of figures in the distance, coats darkened with water, heads bowed not in shame, but in calm determination. Rainwalkers. Or, in their own modest terms, the moderately afflicted out for a constitutional. You join them. The road winds past low stone walls, past ivy-slicked churches and half-shuttered tea shops. The air smells of smoke and sodden leather, and something else, mildew, yes, but also possibility. It's hard to explain. You feel slightly ridiculous, yes, but also a little more awake. Or at least aware. You notice things now, the way droplets gather on window panes like beads of time. The way puddles ripple with each step, scattering reflections. The way your own thoughts stop circling like birds and finally perch. One fringe theory, probably the work of a particularly poetic physician, suggested that walking in rain forced the soul to slow down and match the tempo of the falling sky. You don't know if that's true. But you do know that this is the first time today you haven't thought about the things you were supposed to be doing. And that counts for something. As you turn a corner, you pass what was once a hydropathic institute, a place where wealthy patients came to get soaked in cold water under the supervision of well-meaning men in waistcoats. These places offered rainwalks as part of a full treatment menu, cold wraps, icy baths, and forced discussions about the moral value of moss. Hydropathy was all the rage for a while. Some believed that cold water shocked the soul back into alignment. Others thought it simply reminded people what sensation felt like, especially if they'd gone numb from too many years of sitting indoors pretending they didn't hate their neighbors. Of course, there were skeptics. There always are. But more on them later. For now, you breathe deeply. The rain has settled into a gentle rhythm now. Not quite drizzle, not quite mist. Just presence. Soft enough to feel on your eyelashes, steady enough to fill the silence. You're alone again. Just you, the cobblestones, and the sky, dripping its vague approval onto your collarbone like some kind of Victorian merit badge. You're still cold. Still damp. But you're moving. And maybe that's enough. At some point, the question arises, if walking in the rain is so great for your nerves, why not just use an umbrella? It seems reasonable. You're already doing the hard part, trudging through cold puddles and misty air in full Victorian attire. Surely there's no shame in sheltering your upper half from a full-on soaking. Ah, but you'd be wrong. Because in the eyes of many Victorian physicians, the umbrella wasn't just a practical tool. It was a cop-out. You pause on a narrow footpath bordered by hedges, the rain now falling in fine, persistent sheets. The kind that seeps in slowly and settles into your socks like it's signing a lease. Your hand instinctively twitches toward the idea of an umbrella. Just a small one. Black silk. With a curved handle. No one would judge. Except Dr. Hargrove, who in 1872 published a passionate essay titled The Shielding of the Head, on the moral dangers of umbrella dependency. Yes, that's a real thing that existed. See, umbrellas were controversial not because they didn't work, but because they did. And anything that made a rain walk too easy, or too pleasant, was seen as diluting the therapeutic effect. Historians still argue whether this anti-umbrella sentiment was based more on moralizing than medicine. Probably both. But in the eyes of the more rigidly enthusiastic doctors, shielding yourself from discomfort was, essentially, cheating. To reap the true benefits of the rain, you had to let it touch you. Chill your cheeks. Dampen your scalp. Drape you in discomfort. Only then could the nervous system fully engage with the elements, as Dr. Hargrove dramatically put it. This was all part of a larger belief system that viewed suffering, controlled suffering, as inherently cleansing. Umbrellas, by shielding the body, were seen as shielding the soul from the full experience of weather-borne humility. One pamphlet from 1881 went so far as to say, "Umbrellas may preserve one's hat, but they do little to restore one's honor." You try not to laugh as rain slides down the back of your neck. It wasn't just about discomfort, though. There were practical, if odd, theories, too. For instance, it was thought that exposure to falling rain helped regulate the pulse, encouraging better blood flow. An umbrella would interfere with that natural calibration. Some physicians even claim that the sound of rain on your body, the specific tactile percussion of droplets hitting your shoulders and chest, was more calming than the distant tapping of rain on an umbrella canopy. A kind of internal lullaby, if you will. One especially passionate physician, Dr. Julia Fenwick, argued that the umbrella interferes with nature's conversation. She claimed patients who walked bareheaded in the rain reported more vivid dreams, softer tempers, and a surprising increase in appetite. You're not sure if she was onto something or just hadn't eaten properly in weeks, but the anecdote stuck. Then there were the aesthetics. Rain, many believed, brought out a kind of beauty that umbrellas actively hid. The way hair curled in damp air. The sheen of moisture on wool. The subtle drama of droplets rolling down a cheek. One rain-walking club in Edinburgh even banned umbrellas outright, citing them as a visual blight upon the sincerity of the downpour. It became a sort of fashion statement. A quiet rebellion against polish and perfection. Let the wealthy carry umbrellas on their carriage rides, real connoisseurs of health marched proudly through the storm. One fringe group took things even further. The Society for the Intact Sky, a small collective of weather purists, believed that any man-made barrier between oneself and the sky, even on rainy days, was a spiritual insult. They didn't just avoid umbrellas. They rejected awnings. These people would rather be soaked than cross under a cafe's outdoor canopy. There is one recorded case of a man refusing to enter a shop until the rain stopped simply because the door had a small overhead shelter. He stood in the street for 3 hours, soaking wet, eating a turnip. Dedication or damp delusion? You decide. Even umbrella design came under scrutiny. The new quick spring models were seen as dangerously convenient. Too easy. Too modern. And anything modern in the Victorian period always had a few people panicking about moral decay. To the dismay of practical minds everywhere, this anti-umbrella stance caught on in certain circles. You could tell a health-focused walker from an ordinary one by their lack of rain protection and, often, their slightly defiant posture. Because make no mistake, walking in the rain without an umbrella became a statement. It said, "Yes, I am damp. Yes, I am mildly cold. But also, I am purging myself of urban decay and inner turmoil through this dignified drenching. And maybe, just maybe, you are too." You round a corner into an open square, where a statue of Queen Victoria peers down, perpetually unamused. The pigeons have gone. The air smells of smoke and wet stone. A young couple passes, sharing a single umbrella, walking close together. It's sweet. It's also, by 1880 medical standards, a waste of atmospheric therapy. You walk past them and feel the rain land directly on the top of your head. It's not exactly pleasant, but there's something bracing about it. Clarifying. You become aware of every step. The slap of your boot soles. The weight of your coat. The rhythm of breath. The strange quiet that rain creates even in a city. You're part of the weather now. Not avoiding it. Not resisting. Just walking straight through it. Umbrella-free. The mud is extensive. You've stepped in it at least 4 times now, and your boots no longer make a satisfying click on the path. It's more of a slurp. The kind of sound that suggests your foot might not come out again. And still, you carry on, because somewhere between squelch number 2 and mist-blown sign number 15, you've begun to understand why this whole thing caught on. In the late 1800s, rain walking wasn't just prescribed, it became a trend. Specifically, among the British middle class. See, once something got a little medical legitimacy, and enough moody poets started doing it, it only took 1 or 2 issues of the Ladies' Journal of Moderate Health to make it fashionable. And rain walking? It ticked all the boxes, morally upright, physically respectable, and slightly miserable in a way that made you seem serious. So what if your cloak was dripping into your gloves? That just meant you were engaged in wellness. In fact, muddy boots became a kind of social shorthand. Not the caked filth of field work, of course, that was still seen as unsightly, but the artistic kind of mud. The one that says, I have braved nature for my mental clarity, and possibly to clear up that vague ache behind my left eye. One particularly stylish London magazine even featured a recurring column titled Of Raindrops and Reason, in which gentlemen wrote long, contemplative letters about how walking ankle-deep through Hyde Park during a downpour helped them recover from spiritual fatigue. Historians still argue whether the popularity of rain walking stemmed more from medical advice or from a quiet class-based performance of inner virtue. Because in Victorian society, how you suffered mattered. It had to be just enough discomfort, noble, but not desperate. Think, damp collar, not trench foot. And rain, it turns out, was perfect for that. It let you suffer with dignity. You stroll past a row of terraced homes now, all gray brick and bay windows with the occasional curtain twitching inside. Somewhere, a kettle is boiling. Somewhere else, someone is sighing dramatically and reaching for a lap blanket. But not you. You're out here, boots heavy with mud, coat stiff from cold rain, carrying the faint pride of someone who's opted into being slightly miserable on purpose. Because that, too, became a thing. For the Victorian middle class, self-improvement through discomfort was almost a moral obligation. Walks in the rain were not just healthy, they were character-building. They showed you had time to invest in your betterment, that you could afford to be thoughtful. A little dampness proved you had nothing more pressing to do than reflect on your nervous system. It's worth noting that some upper-class folks did participate, but with far more layers, better boots, and servants trailing behind with towels. The middle class, though, they were the true enthusiasts. Caught between wealth and toil, too refined for factories but too anxious for drawing rooms, they found in rain walking a kind of purpose. Some clubs were formed around it. The Society of the Weather-Bitten started in Manchester, originally as a loose collective of friends meeting every Sunday to march around the moors, regardless of weather. Eventually, it grew into a modestly attended walking group with uniforms, dark wool, silver pins in the shape of clouds, and monthly bulletins detailing notable drizzles. Then there was the St. Swithin Stompers in York, who believed the wetter the walk, the purer the spirit. They once held an annual competition called the Dampest Mile, judged not on time but on how soaked participants got by the end. Your coat wouldn't win, but it'd definitely qualify. You pass a stone gate now, its iron latch slick with rain. Just inside the fence lies a path winding through an old cemetery where ivy clings to headstones like a shivering shawl. You detour inside, not out of morbidity, but because even Victorians knew there was something deeply poetic about wet grass and silence. This, too, was part of it. The setting mattered. Rain walks weren't supposed to be urban if it could be helped. Yes, people marched through London's parks, but the ideal was somewhere a little overgrown, a little grim. Preferably with fog. Bonus points for crumbling walls. There was a belief, half superstition, half earnest hope, that being out in the rain among older things made your mind more stable. One doctor even wrote that the past weathers us, just as rain softened stone. A bit much, maybe, but he did have very nice handwriting. And then there were the accessories. Rainwalkers didn't need many, but what they had, they took seriously. Woolen cloaks were preferred, not because they were waterproof, they very much weren't, but because they absorbed rain in a way that felt noble. Heavy coats were seen as proof of commitment. Dripping hems were practically spiritual merit badges. Some even carried little brass journals on waterproof string, so they could jot down rain-induced thoughts without breaking stride. You stopped near a crumbling mausoleum, water trickling down its stone face. Somewhere, you read, a young woman once proposed to her sweetheart right here during a thunderstorm, because she believed proposals should happen only when the sky feels exactly how one's nerves do. That tracks. Victorian logic was often less logic and more thematic resonance. And in that spirit, your next few steps feel somehow heavier. Not unpleasant, just weighty. As though the mud on your boots is both a nuisance and a kind of quiet badge. You are one of the treasures now. You press on. Past the graves, past the moss, past the puddles that mirror the gray sky. You're not thinking about your inbox. Or your errands. Or what you forgot to cook for dinner. You're just walking. Through it. With the rain. With the weight of the coat. With the squelch in your heel. And it feels, somehow, just right. By now, the rain is no longer just a backdrop. It's a character. Quiet, consistent, slightly smug. It clings to you like an overeager acquaintance, trailing every step, breathing down your neck, gentle, persistent, and always just cold enough to make you wonder if you forgot something. Like common sense. Or dry socks. And yet, you feel oddly invigorated. Not in a jog up a hill sort of way. More in a maybe I can survive this century sort of way. This is exactly what Victorian physicians were counting on. Because as odd as it sounds, there was a growing belief that nature, especially in its raw, unpolished form, was the missing piece in modern health. And among the most vocal believers in this theory were those who began prescribing what they called climatic remedies, doses of fresh air, specific temperatures, and yes, regular exposure to raw elements like rain. They believed that nature could retune the human body. That the rhythms of weather could somehow recalibrate overstimulated minds. Historians still argue whether this idea was born from scientific observation or simply romantic nostalgia wrapped in soggy wool. Either way, it stuck. So instead of reaching for another bottle of tincture, many Victorian doctors began writing actual prescriptions that read like vague camping instructions. Walk 2 miles daily in steady mist. Seek out low wind and open skies. Rainfall at twilight is most recommended. Seriously. You weren't just being sent outside, you were being sent into the right kind of outside. And the right kind of outside was wild. Wet. Unfiltered. No polished parks with neat gravel trails. No manicured hedges or dry bandstands. No, thank you. The preferred terrain was rough earth, muddy paths, bracken-covered slopes. Bonus points if it smelled faintly of peat and disappointment. You follow a narrow trail now, hedged by tall grass and slick roots. Every few feet, your boot threatens to slide out from under you. It's not graceful. But that's sort of the point. This was nature as challenge. Not a pleasure stroll, but a confrontation with the self. A walking version of cold therapy, but with more clouds and fewer influencers. One particularly poetic doctor, Dr. Edwin Brearley, described it this way. In walking beneath falling sky, the body learns submission and the mind unlearns confusion. That quote ended up etched above the entrance of a small health retreat in Devonshire that specialized in rain therapy. The building is long gone now, but somewhere in an attic, someone probably still has the pamphlet. It wasn't all just metaphor, though. There was a medical logic, too, at least, the Victorian version of logic. The theory went like this: the body, when exposed to natural elements like cold rain or brisk wind, enters a minor state of stress. Not dangerous, but enough to jolt the system out of stagnation. It forced your blood to circulate more efficiently, your lungs to work harder, your senses to sharpen. The damp air opened the sinuses, it was said. The shock of cold water against skin revivified the nerves. And the psychological side effects? Profound. Many patients, especially those suffering from what was then called hysteria or nervous torpor, reported feeling more awake, more grounded, more present. Which, in an age of indoor gaslight, thick velvet curtains, and constant moral hand-wringing, was no small thing. There's even record of one well-known barrister who claimed his entire career turnaround began the day his doctor told him to walk into weather with humility. He did. Every morning. For a year. Rain or shine. But especially rain. Eventually, he stopped fainting in court and even delivered a famously passionate speech while soaking wet, which earned him the nickname the Damp Defender. True story. Possibly exaggerated. But are most stories? Of course, not everyone took to it with such fervor. Some merely endured the walks, treating them like a bitter medicine. Others leaned into it fully, wearing specially designed cloaks with inner weights so the fabric wouldn't flap in high winds, and recording their climate moods in little red notebooks. These journals, many of which still exist in archives, are full of entries like April 4th, heavy drizzle, mood contemplative. June 2nd, brief shower, experienced sudden craving for marmalade. September 12th, walked under full rain. Enlightenment unlikely, but knees warm. And while some of the logic now feels outdated, or at least suspiciously poetic, modern scientists have occasionally stumbled onto surprising parallels. Today we call it forest bathing, cold exposure, grounding, intentional discomfort. They called it walking into drizzle until your hat sagged and your thoughts cleared. You pass a weathered sign now, its paint faded, this way to the healing path. Likely left over from one of those early wellness movements that set up shop in the countryside. Most failed. People, as it turns out, like the idea of rustic healing more than the actual practice of soaking themselves daily. Still, something about it lingers. You follow the path. The wind picks up, just enough to make your wet sleeves slap against your wrists. Your breath fogs. A single drop hits the tip of your nose like punctuation. It's uncomfortable. But you don't mind. Because for once, discomfort isn't a problem to solve. It's a tool. You hear it before you see it. The steady trickle. The softened splash. A gentle sort of music played entirely on stone and time. Just up ahead, half veiled by bramble and mist, is a small Victorian rain shelter, more decorative than practical, tucked into the bend of the path like an apology from the weather. You step inside, not to escape the rain, heaven forbid, but to observe it. Because for some Victorians, watching the rain was nearly as medicinal as walking in it. Yes, standing in the middle of a storm earned you spiritual street cred, but sitting quietly under a leaky roof, watching water fall from slate eaves? That was the kind of passive therapy beloved by poets, clergymen, and overly sensitive men with weak digestion. These little shelters, found in parks, along woodland paths, and near train stations, were built not to keep people dry, but to offer brief reflection zones. Think of them as proto-mindfulness pods, complete with wooden benches, damp ivy, and the ever-present smell of mildew. One 1885 etiquette manual even included a chapter called On the Contemplation of Rainfall, a suitable practice for gentlemen of nervous disposition. You lean back against the bench and watch droplets collect on the edge of your coat. Inhale. Exhale. There it is again, that strange stillness that rain brings. Like time itself is softening around the edges. Doctors noticed it too. While most encouraged movement, others began writing about the benefits of stillness within the storm. Just being near rain, they claimed, triggered a sort of psychic detox. Some even said rain produced negative ions that made people feel calmer. Historians still argue whether this idea was based on actual chemistry or just an extremely hopeful interpretation of a soothe mood. But for patients with frayed nerves and too many opinions rattling in their heads, a quiet moment with the rain was practically spiritual. There's a report from a Dr. Helena Cavell, who ran a seaside clinic specializing in natural overstimulation deflation. Her method? Patients sat under open wooden eaves while it rained, bundled in damp woolen shawls, and were encouraged to name 3 sorrows and release them into the storm. It sounds absurd. It probably was absurd. But one patient later wrote in her diary that she hadn't slept so well in years. Rain, she said, washes away the thoughts that cling. You try it. Pick a thought. Let it drip out of your head with the rhythm of the drops on your sleeve. The discomfort fades a little. Or maybe you've just made peace with it. Because this, too, was part of the Victorian rain prescription, acclimation. The longer you stayed in the wet, the more it stopped feeling like punishment. The cold didn't shrink your soul, it defined its edges. The water didn't drown your thoughts, it sifted them. And as you sit there, listening to the world grow quieter and wetter, you notice something else, other people doing the same thing. A man in a waistcoat passes, walking slowly, hands behind his back like he's inspecting the raindrops for grammar errors. 2 older women in cloaks nod to each other under a tree, rain dripping from the brims of their bonnets. A boy with a wooden walking stick trails behind them, looking vaguely poetic. You're all participants in the same unspoken ritual. It wasn't unusual back then to see entire clusters of rainwalkers gathered in city parks. They didn't talk. Talking was discouraged. That would disturb the therapeutic silence. Instead, they walked together, separately. A communal solitude. Everyone drenched. Everyone oddly content. Some groups even formed what were called silent weather societies. No meetings, no rules, no newsletters, just a shared understanding that walking in the same rain somehow made you part of something. One such society, in Oxford, carried small lapel pins in the shape of a raindrop. If you saw someone wearing one, you were permitted a nod of solidarity and then back to your internal monologue. It was all so deeply British. Of course, it wasn't only Britain that dabbled in therapeutic precipitation. France had its own rain-based wellness circles. So did Germany, where doctors frequently advised gentle exposure to northern drizzle as part of a broader Lebensreform, life reform, movement. But no one embraced the grim romance of wet walking quite like the Victorians. You rise from the bench now, the back of your coat slightly damp where the shelter leaked. The rain has slowed a bit, not stopped, of course. Just paused, like it's catching its breath. Or letting you catch yours. The world feels wider again. You walk back out into it. The drizzle resumes as if cued. You round a corner and see a pair of muddy boot prints ahead of you. Someone else has walked this path recently, just as slowly, just as deliberately. You follow the prints, not because you need to, but because it's comforting to know someone else has trudged through this, too. There's no finish line. No brass plaque waiting to congratulate you for enduring a light soak. Just more path. More rain. And, surprisingly, you're okay with that. Maybe even better than okay. You pass a low wall draped in moss, and your coat brushes a wet branch that leaves a line of water across your shoulder. A few weeks ago, that might have ruined your morning. Now, it feels like part of the treatment. Because what if, as those stiff-collared, rain-obsessed doctors believed, there is something healing in surrendering to what you can't control? Not fixing the weather. Not cursing it. Just walking through it. Drip by drip. Thought by thought. One soggy miracle at a time. Your boots are now fully integrated with the mud. They're less like footwear and more like honorary members of the landscape, heavily caked, gloriously slow, and emitting faint squelching sounds that Victorian poets might have described as the music of earthy resolve. But you keep moving, because somewhere between all the dampness and the drizzle, you've come to accept that this walk doesn't end at a destination. It ends when you're done being weathered. And the Victorians had a term for this exact experience: beneficial saturation. It wasn't just about getting wet, it was about getting wet enough. Enough that the body yielded its stubborn tension. Enough that the nervous energy ran out of things to buzz about. Enough that you stopped resisting the weather and let it reshape your mood like soft clay. This is where you'd be introduced to one of the era's most persistent ideas, neurasthenia. It was the fashionable illness of the 19th century, vague, sweeping, and nearly universal among the middle and upper classes. Symptoms included fatigue, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, feeling too much, and having opinions about wallpaper. Doctors couldn't quite define it, but they agreed on one thing: it was modern life's fault. Historians still argue whether neurasthenia was a real disorder or just a very polite way to describe being constantly overwhelmed while wearing a corset. But either way, the treatment often involved, yes, you guessed it, controlled exposure to weather. Rain walking was the ideal prescription. It was quiet, humbling, and conveniently free. It required no conversation, no medicine, no dangerous side effects, unless you counted trench foot. Plus, it allowed patients to feel like they were doing something heroic, even if that something was walking in a circle until their coat grew moss. You walk now past a stream swollen from the rainfall, its surface broken by fat drops and the occasional floating leaf. Everything smells like wet bark and cold stone. A blackbird hops along the path ahead of you, pausing every few steps to check if you're still following. You are. You're not thinking about your inbox. Or the creaky hip. Or the 47 things you meant to do this week. You're just here. Dripping slightly. But alive. In Victorian mental health circles, this kind of presence was seen as medicine in its purest form. They didn't have words like mindfulness or somatic grounding, but they believed deeply that physical contact with natural discomfort pulled the mind out of abstraction and into the body. Hence all the rain. Some doctors even encouraged what they called slow march immersion, walking so slowly through bad weather that the cold and damp penetrated, yes, but gently. Not all at once. A kind of gradual sogginess meant to lull the system into calm compliance. It sounds absurd. But as you shuffle over a mossy log bridge and pause to wipe your sleeve across your forehead, it's hard to deny the effect. You're no longer fighting the elements. You're cooperating. There was even a noted psychiatrist, Dr. Ambrose Killingly, yes, really, who claimed that patients who committed to 30 days of twice-daily rain walks reported a 43% reduction in mental agitation and a 200% increase in knowing how damp trousers feel. He was prone to exaggeration. But his clinic in Yorkshire saw a steady stream of patients, many of whom swore the walks did more for them than months of bed rest or bitter tonics. One woman, Eleanor Marsh, wrote in her recovery notes that by the third week of walking in drizzle, I no longer longed for quiet. I was quiet. It wasn't just the walking, of course. It was the letting go. The surrender to a thing you couldn't plan, predict, or control. And Rain is very good at being that thing. You pass a wooden post bearing a small, rusted sign, dry path, an option that feels strangely insulting at this point. Like someone offering you an umbrella after you've grown fond of the storm. You ignore it and carry on straight. Past the dripping trees. Past a stone fountain where the water no longer flows because nature's doing a fine job already. Past a group of sheep, huddled together under an ancient oak, blinking at you like, seriously, again with the walking? They don't understand. You're chasing beneficial saturation. And you're not alone. Rain walking groups were often led by what were called elemental stewards, a sort of cross between a tour guide and a really enthusiastic camp counselor. They knew the paths, the safe mud depths, the signs of hypothermia, and the best places to stop for reflective drizzle breaks. They carried pocket watches, thick notebooks, and a faint air of superiority. But they were respected. Sometimes even feared. Because they were known to cancel walks if the weather wasn't foul enough. A sunny day? That was considered a betrayal. No drizzle? That was practically treason. One famous steward in Dorset reportedly ended a session halfway because the rain turned whimsical instead of instructive. Everyone was forced to march twice the distance the next day to compensate for spiritual lightness. You think of that now as you reach the top of a hill and look down over the valley, its green turned silver by the endless mist. It's beautiful. In a damp, gray, quiet sort of way. You stopped looking for the end of the path. You're not checking your watch. You're not wondering when this walk will mean something. It already does. You are participating in a very old, very soggy ritual of recalibration. Boots in mud. Heart in rain. Mind, finally, at peace. At some point, your coat stops feeling wet. Not because it's dry, far from it, but because your brain has given up logging the sensation as new information. It's simply accepted the truth, this is your reality now. A little soggy. A little cold. And somehow, a little free. That was the quiet magic of the Victorian rain prescription, adaptation. Not in the Darwinian, grow gills and live in a swamp kind of way, but in the psychological sense. The longer you walked through discomfort, the more your nervous system gave up the fight and slipped into what one physician poetically called the tranquil murmur of compliance. You walk on. The path curves gently now, winding between low hedges and stone walls gone fuzzy with moss. A hare darts across the trail ahead of you, barely leaving a trace except for a few soft indentations in the wet grass. Even the animals seem more philosophical in the rain. It was around this very idea, adaptation through repeated exposure, that a specific branch of Victorian medicine developed something called the habitual precipitation protocol. And yes, it sounded exactly as ridiculous and important as its name implies. Patients were instructed to immerse themselves in non-threatening inclement conditions for gradually increasing intervals. 5 minutes of rain walking the first day. 10 the next. Up to a full hour by the end of the second week. Doctors tracked the results obsessively. Did the patient cough less? Sleep better? Argue less with their spouse over marmalade preferences? The answer was usually yes. Or at least a bit. One eccentric practitioner, Dr. Percy Glenn, even charted a patient's mood improvement based on the dampness of their journal entries. The soggier the paper, the better the mental state. Historians still argue whether any of these results were medically significant, or whether everyone just developed better handwriting under adversity. You pause by a small gate, its hinges squeaking as you push it open. Beyond it lies a meadow, wide, flat, and dotted with stones that once marked grazing boundaries. The rain here falls slightly heavier, almost musical. And suddenly, you're aware that your pace has slowed without you realizing it. You're not hurrying. Because you don't need to. That's another thing Victorian doctors started noticing: time distortion during weather walks. People stopped clock watching. They stopped fretting over schedules. Some even lost track of entire afternoons. What modern psychology might now call flow state was then seen as a mark of therapeutic success, a patient so present in the moment they forgot the tyranny of the clock. One doctor documented a man who walked for 6 hours in the rain, returning home not tired, but weirdly proud. When asked if he was cold, the man said, "Only at first. Then I became something else." Was it scientific? Dubious. Was it relatable? Completely. Especially now, as you trail a line of stones across the meadow, the hem of your coat sweeping across soaked grass, making that hush-hush sound only wet fabric makes. Even now, long after the Victorians packed up their rain charts and folded away their damp cloaks, some of their instincts persist. Modern wellness trends mirror them more than we'd like to admit. Cold plunges? That's just Victorian stream wading with better branding. Mindfulness walks? That's a Sunday morning drizzle march, minus the bonnet. Digital detox retreats? That's a rain shelter with an Instagram filter. We haven't changed that much. We're still just anxious people trying to trick ourselves into quiet using the oldest tool available, the weather. Of course, not every Victorian agreed with these methods. Some derided rain walking as a moist hysteria fad. Newspaper cartoons poked fun at the image of proper ladies trudging through puddles in velvet boots while muttering about melancholy equilibrium. One scathing article from the Gentleman's Quarterly of Serious Concerns described the trend as a cruel performance of dampness in lieu of actual therapy. But even then, the numbers didn't lie. Clinics saw improvements. Nerves calmed. Insomnia waned. One practitioner even described rain walking as reconnecting the body's clock with the sky's intention. Whatever that means, it sounded impressive enough to fund 2 more weather clinics in Cornwall. You reach the far end of the meadow now, where the path narrows into a lane of slick flagstones. Your boots scuff and squeak, but they hold. You think back to something Dr. Hargrove wrote in his journal. Let the patient not resist the rain. Let him move through it with the solemn joy of a man forgiving his own body for being alive. Dramatic? Absolutely. But somehow, right now, you get it. Because walking in the rain does something odd to your internal monologue. It makes it quieter. Or maybe not quieter, just simpler. Less abstract. You're no longer thinking about things. You're just being in them. Which is, in its own damp, Victorian way, a kind of therapy. A group of crows watches from the stone wall ahead, their feathers puffed against the chill. They look like they're judging you. They probably are. But you're too far into the habitual precipitation protocol to care. You've hit what Victorian doctors would have called drenched stability. You are as wet as you are going to be. You have adapted. Your steps are steady. Your breath matches the rhythm of the drops. The wind is not your enemy anymore. It's your walking companion. And somewhere back in 1892, someone wearing a too heavy cloak and a slightly unhinged smile might have walked this exact route, convinced, just like you, that the rain was doing something quietly heroic to their mind. And maybe they were right. Because here you are. Still walking. Still calm. Still here. Somewhere along the way, you stop feeling like a person trudging through a rainy landscape and start feeling like a part of it. You're not walking in the rain anymore, you're with it. A co-star. A mood. An accidental philosopher in soggy boots. This, curiously enough, was exactly what some Victorian health theorists claimed rainwalking was ultimately for: reintegration with the natural order. Which sounds lofty, but really just meant stop being such an anxious meatbag and go touch a damp leaf. You glance around. To your left, water trickles down the hollow of an old oak's roots. To your right, the distant curve of a hillside disappears into mist, like a watercolor painting someone forgot to finish. And in front of you, well, just more path. Endless, beautiful, puddled path. In 1889, a Scottish physician named Dr. Cedric Mooring argued in a pamphlet that no one asked for but everyone read, that modern ailments weren't caused by germs or diet, but by removal from rhythm. According to him, the human body was designed to move with weather, not against it. Sunshine was obvious. But rain? Rain was the tuning fork of the soul. Historians still argue whether Dr. Mooring was a visionary or just a man who got caught in a storm once and never emotionally recovered. Either way, his ideas took off. Clinics began offering packages that included scheduled rain walks, storm sit-ins, and even guided melancholy strolls by instructors who referred to themselves, unironically, as weather monks. Some of the more committed patients kept personal rain diaries where they tracked how different types of weather impacted their mood. These journals were filled with delightfully Victorian phrases like, "Fine sleet today, mild despair, but clarity at breakfast." "Soft drizzle, reminisced about my father, forgave my neighbor." "Unexpected hail, transcendental moment beside the compost bin." You think about that now, as you cross a small wooden bridge. The planks creak under your feet, slick and dark, rain pooling between each slat. A sheep bleats somewhere nearby. You wonder what a sheep would write in its rain diary. Probably just, "Wet, again." Your own mood? Surprisingly light. That's the other thing. Mood modulation through elemental discomfort, a very long-winded way of saying that sometimes getting a little miserable can be deeply satisfying. It resets expectations. Rain makes the world smaller, in the best way. You're not overwhelmed by distant goals or abstract fears. You're just wondering if that next puddle is deep enough to swallow your ankle. Spoiler, it is. You step into it anyway. Because you're not here to win. You're here to weather. That's the difference. A lot of Victorian health theories were weird, yes, but they weren't all wrong. Some of them recognized what modern life tends to ignore, that comfort isn't always the cure. That sometimes, intentional inconvenience is the reset your nervous system is begging for. Especially when it comes in the form of a very wet sky and a stubborn, squishy trail. In fact, by the late 19th century, there was a growing subculture of elemental optimists, people who believed the weather wasn't something to suffer, but to celebrate. They hosted damp tea parties. They held poetry readings under umbrellas. One group in Somerset even performed a soggy, slow-motion version of Hamlet entirely in the rain. To drip, or not to drip. Of course, not everyone approved. Some critics accused the rainwalkers of romanticizing suffering. Others pointed out that many of the most enthusiastic participants were those with enough money to own multiple coats and a backup butler. And they weren't wrong. There was a definite class divide. For wealthier Victorians, getting caught in the rain was a lifestyle choice. For the working class, it was just Tuesday. Still, the movement insisted that voluntary exposure was different. That choosing to be rained on gave the discomfort meaning. That you could walk through something difficult and be better on the other side. And really, isn't that what everyone wanted? To believe that weather could heal you? You reach the crest of a gentle hill and pause to look back at where you came from. The trail winds behind you like a story, muddy, mysterious, deeply damp. You've walked through bramble and drizzle, past moss and muttered poetry, across bridges and into puddles, and you're still going. No trumpets. No rewards. Just the quiet satisfaction of forward motion. Dr. Mooring, remember him? The weather-tuned soul guy wrote one final book before retiring to a life of moderate obscurity. In it, he described a patient who, after 29 days of rain walking, wrote simply, "Today I remembered my own company is good company." It wasn't groundbreaking. It wasn't diagnostic. But it stuck with people. Because so many of us spend our lives trying to fix ourselves by adding things, apps, pills, books, productivity systems. And here was a man suggesting that maybe we just needed a bit less protection. A little more exposure. And a decent pair of boots. The wind shifts slightly. It carries the smell of soaked earth, distant chimney smoke, and the faint sweetness of something blooming despite the gloom. You tighten your coat, tuck your hands in your pockets, and keep going. No fanfare. Just you and the rain. And a trail that doesn't need to end to be worth walking. By now, your internal weather report has completely synced with the external one. You're not just in the rain, you're fluent in its language. You can tell the difference between drizzle and mist by the way it lands on your eyebrows. You can sense the weight of the clouds in your kneecaps. Congratulations. You're basically a soggy barometer with a working soul. The Victorians would have been very proud. In fact, there's a good chance they would have handed you a little bronze pin in the shape of a raindrop and inducted you into the Order of Therapeutic Moisture, a very unofficial, and slightly fictional, club made up of those who had, according to rainwalk doctrine, endured the elements and found clarity beneath gray skies. You tread carefully now along a narrow path flanked by ferns, their fronds glistening. Water runs in thin rivulets down the stones. Somewhere in the near distance, a church bell tolls, soft, muffled by the wet air. Even sound walks slower in the rain. And in this stillness, you start to notice things that might otherwise slip past unnoticed. A snail carving its grand path across the stone. The way droplets gather into perfect spheres on a single leaf. How your breath leaves little ghosts behind you. This kind of hyper-awareness, the Victorians called rain meditation. It wasn't a formal practice, at least not in the modern sense. No pillows or mantras or subscription services. Just the act of walking in bad weather and paying such close attention to your surroundings that your brain stopped having time to spiral inward. One philosopher-physician, Dr. Linton Foxwood, called it locomotive surrender. You kept moving, but gave up control. Let your eyes wander, your thoughts soften, and your body attune itself to whatever the clouds decided to do next. Historians still argue whether this practice had any real therapeutic benefit or if it was just a poetic excuse to wander around not making eye contact with other people. But you know what? It works. Because you haven't thought about anything stressful in at least 3 fields and a grove. There's a simplicity to walking in wetness. You're no longer managing an identity, or navigating relationships, or planning a presentation. You're just trying not to trip over a root while admiring a mushroom that looks like a pastry. You think of those Victorian journals again, the ones filled with weather mood entries and fog-induced reflections. One woman, a Miss Adelaide Finley, famously wrote, "I walked through 6 forms of drizzle today and remembered my mother's voice for the first time in months." Another, less romantically, noted, "I slipped twice and landed in mud, but oddly feel more like myself than I did at breakfast." Rain didn't fix them. It didn't erase trauma or dissolve depression. But it did change their pace. And sometimes that's enough. You reach a small clearing where an old iron bench sits crooked in the grass, like it gave up trying to stand straight sometime around the Crimean War. You sit down anyway. The rain's light now. More of a presence than an action. Like static in the air. You tilt your head back, let a few drops fall onto your face, and close your eyes for a moment. Everything slows. Your heartbeat. Your thoughts. Even the way you breathe. The Victorians called this atmospheric yielding. It was when the weather finally wore you down in the best way, stripped you of your urgency and left behind a version of yourself that wasn't constantly bracing for the next thing. You weren't broken. You weren't failing. You were saturated. And that was the goal. This kind of walking became so popular in certain parts of England that some towns built entire trails designed specifically for rain walking. Paths that meandered through damp valleys, across mossy bridges, past groves of lichen-covered trees, all chosen not for their beauty, but for their ability to hold onto water. They were called reflective routes. And they often came with small trail markers engraved with encouragements like, "Keep going. The rain is listening. Stillness walks beside you. You're not lost. You're wandering correctly." One surviving sign, now in a museum in Bath, reads simply, "Soaked is not the same as broken." You think about that as you rise and continue walking. Because it's true. Being uncomfortable doesn't mean you failed. Being wet and cold and unsure doesn't mean you're lost, it just means you're somewhere real. One last puddle ahead, deceptively deep. You step in anyway. Let the water seep in. Let the swish echo in your boot like applause. You imagine a Victorian doctor nodding approvingly from behind a fogged monocle. "Excellent saturation levels," he might say. "Very promising mud consistency." You thank him politely and continue on, a little wetter, a little wiser. The rain starts up again in earnest now, not heavy, just committed. Like it wants to see if you'll flinch. But you don't. Because by now, the storm isn't against you. It's walking beside you. The wind shifts again, just slightly. Enough to nudge a wet strand of hair across your forehead and remind you, oh yes, you're still human, and you are still most definitely outside. But instead of groaning, you smile. It's official. You've crossed the threshold. Victorian doctors had a name for this moment, weather acclimatus. A slightly made-up Latin phrase, but they said it with enough confidence that it sounded legitimate. It referred to the point during your therapeutic rain walk when you stopped noticing the weather as an inconvenience and started absorbing it like medicine. Not the sugar-coated kind. The bitter, awkward kind that works slowly and makes you question your choices for the first 45 minutes. But eventually, it works. And now, here you are. Not resisting. Not bracing. Just breathing. You pass beneath a stand of tall beech trees. Their canopies droop under the weight of the water, sheltering the space beneath like a wet cathedral. Raindrops filter through in rhythmic intervals, like nature's own leaky metronome. You slow your pace, because it feels right. Rain does that, it doesn't ask you to slow down. It simply makes every hurried step feel foolish until you're forced to accept a better rhythm. One closer to the pulse of the earth. Or at least the thud of your own boots. This phenomenon became so common that some practitioners started building it into the treatment. One Dr. Loretta Quinn wrote extensively about a slowness threshold, a point when patients began unconsciously walking at half speed. She called it body-paced healing. Historians still argue whether this was therapeutic or just the natural byproduct of wet socks and pure stubbornness. Regardless, you're feeling it now. And it's kind of beautiful. You're aware of your hands in your pockets, your coat brushing your thighs, the exact pressure of each footstep. You're in your body, not floating in regrets or lost in next week's anxiety spiral. Just walking. Just here. The Victorians were obsessed with cataloging these mental shifts. Many weather clinics kept what were essentially mood-tracking logs, where patients would jot down their thoughts before and after rain exposure. One particularly chatty gentleman in Sussex wrote, "Arrived grumpy and doubtful. Departed damp, introspective, and deeply interested in moss. You pass some moss now. Thick, brilliant green. It clings to a crumbling wall with the quiet determination of someone who knows they're underrated. You stop and touch it. Cool. Spongy. Alive in a way that makes you feel slightly more alive, too. That's the strange paradox of rain. It softens the world, but it sharpens your attention." One French practitioner, a reverend doctor named Tobias Wick, even believed rain had a moral effect. He claimed that walking in it made people more humble. That after enough exposure to the sky's quiet rebuke, you emerge kinder, softer, less inclined to argue about who left the teapot empty. Was it true? Hard to say. But you'd be lying if you said the rain hadn't changed your mood. There's a clarity that comes after being thoroughly soaked and realizing you're still standing, still thinking, still, somehow, okay. You duck under a low-hanging branch and step over a puddle with all the grace of someone who's accepted that grace is optional. The water ripples, disturbed but undisturbed, like everything in this strange gray ritual. Ahead, the path winds toward a small wooden stile. You clamber over it, slightly less elegantly than a Victorian nobleman, but arguably more authentically, and land with a soft squelch on the other side. A hedgerow lines the trail now. Rain drips from its leaves in perfect intervals. Plip. Plop. Plip. The sound is hypnotic, like a lullaby written by someone who owns a lot of umbrellas. You remember something from a journal entry you saw once, written in nearly illegible ink. Rain does not shout. It insists. And that's exactly it. It insists. Not aggressively. Not cruelly. Just firmly. Persistently. Like a teacher who doesn't raise their voice but somehow still makes you sit up straighter. The Victorian therapists knew this. They designed their clinics and retreats to foster this kind of environmental authority. Rain walks weren't just outdoor strolls. They were exercises in yielding. A patient would arrive bristling with opinions, schedules, mental to-do lists written in panic ink, and leave, several weeks later, with slower steps and quieter eyes. One patient even wrote, "It is difficult to remain self-important when your knees are muddy." You glance down. Your own knees aren't quite muddy yet, but your boots have given up the fight. They're now sponges shaped vaguely like footwear. Every step squishes. Every squish hums like a little applause from the earth. You pass a crooked wooden sign, almost unreadable now, "Path continues," if you do. It doesn't matter if it's official or graffiti. It's the most Victorian rainwalker thing you've ever seen. And so, of course, you follow it. Because that's what this has become. Not a journey with a map, but a kind of faith. A soggy trust in forward motion. The belief that each step through discomfort peels something heavy off your shoulders. Something you weren't sure you could carry anymore. And now, maybe you don't have to. The path narrows again, threading its way between two mossy banks like a trail someone whispered into existence. Ferns bow politely as you pass. Water glistens on every surface. Even the rocks look contemplative, like they've been brooding for centuries and have just now come to terms with their existence. Your boots slosh with each step, but you no longer care. In fact, there's something oddly satisfying about the sound now. Like a heartbeat that's finally keeping time with something bigger than you. That was the goal of many Victorian rain therapies, synchronicity. Not just between body and weather, but between person and planet. The idea that all this pacing through puddles was leading you toward a gentler internal rhythm. Less resistance. Less hurry. The world, they insisted, would keep turning even if you stopped trying to sprint ahead of it. One Scottish physician, Dr. Elspeth Turn, who ran a small weather-based sanatorium in the Highlands, believed that anxiety was simply the body's failed attempt to match the pace of nature. Her solution? Assign patients drizzle tracking exercises. For 1 hour a day, you had to follow a single raindrop as far as your eyes could keep up. If it rolled off a leaf, you followed it to the ground. If it joined another drop, you tracked the new one. It was absurd. It was impossible. And reportedly, it worked. Historians still argue whether that kind of focus had lasting neurological effects or was just a very damp form of distraction. But either way, it quieted people. And sometimes that's all a person needs. You reach a gate that opens into an orchard. The trees stand in solemn rows, bare of fruit but heavy with mist. Rain collects in their branches, forming temporary pearls before falling, drop by drop, into the soft earth. You walk between them slowly, hearing nothing but the gentle tap of water on bark. And for a moment, you feel it. Stillness. Not the forced kind you try to conjure up during a yoga class in your living room while the neighbor drills into the wall. No, this is the stillness that arrives, unasked, unscheduled, unhurried. A gift from the weather. One Victorian writer referred to this as the hush of earned quiet. The kind of peace that doesn't come from silence, but from alignment. A quiet earned not by fleeing noise, but by becoming one with it. It's here that you remember the lesser-known practice of pacing rain sermons. Not sermons in the religious sense, but philosophical ones. Rambling, wet, spontaneous reflections delivered aloud during walks, usually to no one in particular. A few oddballs kept journals of their own monologues, some of which are still floating around archives. One of the more famous entries, written by a man walking through Epping Forest in a storm, goes, "It is very hard to lie to oneself in the rain. The weather is too honest. You don't speak aloud, but you nod, silently. Because yes, the rain is honest. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't perform. It just is." And maybe that's why the Victorians, in their overly dramatic, velvet-draped way, clung to it so dearly. Because when the world felt too ornate, too artificial, too constrained by lace and etiquette and 17 layers of moral panic, rain offered truth. Wet, cold, slightly inconvenient truth. But truth nonetheless. You reach the end of the orchard where a crumbling stone wall marks the border of the path. You run your hand along it. It's slick with moss and time. Probably built by hands that are long gone now, though the wall remains, weathered, softened, still doing its job. Kind of like you. And here comes the wind again, curling through the trees, kicking up leaves and carrying the scent of something ancient and metallic. Wet iron. Distant smoke. A hint of wood that's been left in the rain too long. You pause. Let it pass. No need to brace anymore. That habit left miles ago. You remember something odd, a footnote from a forgotten pamphlet you skimmed about Victorian storm therapy. It claimed that wind at the right moment may blow away a lingering sadness. And now, standing in the open, coat flapping, hair sticking to your neck, you think, maybe they were right. Because whatever was clinging to you when this walk began? It's not here anymore. It didn't get solved. Or resolved. It just got walked through. Like fog dispersing under pressure. Like a mind finally matching the sky. Some of the more poetic doctors even believed that weather matching could be therapeutic. That if you were feeling heavy, broody, or on the brink of some emotional thunderstorm, it was best to walk in weather that matched that mood. Don't chase the sun, they said. Let the storm meet you. Let it walk beside you. And maybe, if you're lucky, it will walk you back out again. You glance up. The clouds are still thick. Still moody. But somehow, you're not anymore. You move forward with the calm of someone who no longer needs an umbrella or a reason. You're not waiting for the sky to clear. You're just here. Still walking. Still soaking. Still healing. The rain has softened into a fine mist now, barely falling, more like hovering in the air, as if the sky has paused to take a breath. You walk through it like a thought gliding through fog, no resistance, no urgency, just motion for motion's sake. It's quiet, but not empty. You can still hear the low, distant rustle of branches, the occasional tap of a heavy droplet from a leaf too full to hold on any longer. Somewhere nearby, a rook caws once, long and low, like it knows how to hold a grudge against the weather. And as you walk, the path opens into another field, this one wide, overgrown, and dotted with mossy stumps that might once have been benches or stones, or even very bored cows. It doesn't matter now. Time has softened their shapes, the same way it's softened yours. This is the part of the walk the Victorians sometimes called the letting go stretch. It was never official. It wasn't marked on maps or prescribed in pamphlets. But many who practiced long rain walking routes reported that somewhere near the end, usually after mile 4 or 5, something gave way. Not the body. Not quite. But the grip. The grip on whatever emotional load they carried in. Grief, guilt, comparison, resentment, it didn't vanish. But it loosened. Like a too tight boot unlaced by the weather. One rainwalker wrote in 1877, "By the third hour, I forgot to rehearse my pain. I simply carried it, wet and weightless." That's exactly what you feel now. Not that the burden's gone, but that you're no longer performing it. You're just walking with it. And somehow, it feels manageable. Even the ground agrees. It's firmer here, less sink and more spring. Your feet land with confidence again, the mud sticking politely but no longer fighting for dominance. The air smells different too, less sharp, more herbal. Some kind of wet grass and crushed pine, mingled with the vague sweetness of decay. The kind of scent that says, things have fallen here and become useful again. You take a deep breath and feel yourself settle. This was what the Victorians meant by weather transference. The idea that the environment could carry part of your emotional weight, if only you let it. That if you walked far enough, and slowly enough, and got rained on thoroughly enough, the storm would take something from you in return. Not as punishment, but as mercy. Historians still argue whether this belief was rooted in anything real, or whether it was just clever emotional projection wrapped in poetic medical jargon. But they can keep arguing. Because you know how it feels now, in your own waterlogged bones. You're lighter. Not dry. Not fixed. But lighter. The trees thin again, and you pass an old boundary marker, barely a post now, half swallowed by ivy. A crow sits atop it, staring with the unimpressed eyes of someone who's seen hundreds of damp people shuffle past pretending to have profound epiphanies. You nod at it anyway. It's part of this, too. Even the birds seem to belong to the therapy. There's one last incline. The kind that rises slowly enough to feel like a test. Not a punishing one, just a gentle inquiry from the hill, "Are you ready to return?" Because yes, as much as this walk has become a kind of alternate life, there's still the matter of going home. The Victorians understood that part well. Rain walking wasn't supposed to be an escape. It was a rehearsal for re-entry. You left the house with chaos on your heels. You wandered into the wet woods, bristling with opinions and tension and half-written speeches for imaginary arguments. You walked. You got soaked. You sulked. You slowed down. And now, you're almost back. But you're not the same. You climbed the last hill. Your legs are tired in a satisfying way. Your coat hangs heavier than ever. Your hair is doing something not even the strongest pomade could contain. And your face, for once, doesn't feel like it's bracing against anything. At the crest of the hill, you pause. Below, in the misty near distance, you can just make out the edges of rooftops. Chimneys. A cart. A cluster of trees near the edge of town. The world is waiting, but it's not tugging at you. Not yet. And for one last moment, you just stand there, letting it all land. The silence. The mist. The new version of yourself, built slowly by rain and repetition. It's not dramatic. No choirs. No revelations. Just steadiness. One Victorian doctor once wrote, "We mustn't mistake dampness for defeat. The wet soul is often the most awake." And if your soul could be measured in puddles, right now it would be a small pond with very calm ripples. You take the first step downhill. Back toward the familiar. Back toward the dry. But not too fast. Because you're not leading the walk. You're carrying it with you. Every step soaked in softness. Every breath shaped by the storm. And every future panic, maybe, a little easier to walk through, because now you know how to rain walk your way out. The path winds gently downward, but the rain doesn't let up. It remains steady, deliberate, like it has one final lesson to teach before releasing you back into your regularly scheduled life. And you're ready to listen. Because by now, you know how. Not just to hear, but to receive. That's the difference. You're no longer observing the weather as something outside of you. You're walking inside it. With it. As if the rain has slowly made room for you in its vocabulary. This last stretch of your walk feels different. Not because it's easier, your legs are still tired, your coat is heavier than a sleep-deprived elephant, but because your resistance is gone. You've been fully initiated. Welcome to the wet enlightenment. This was, at one point, an actual term used in the writings of a rather dramatic, very damp, Victorian poet naturopath named Basil Hartright. He insisted that people needed to be brought low by the sky in order to find equilibrium. His entire therapy philosophy was based around what he called elemental surrender. Patients in his care were forbidden to carry umbrellas, instructed to wear only wool, which they had to knit themselves, and encouraged to write apology letters to people they no longer disliked after a walk. It was extreme. It was deeply silly. But weirdly, it worked. One woman, bedridden with what was then called nervous malaise, walked daily in drizzle for 2 weeks and claimed she felt more like a person and less like a ghost wrapped in corsets. Historians still argue whether Basil's methods were innovative or just soggy delusions with a nice view of the Morse. But they agree on one thing: the transformation was real. And here you are, embodying that same process. You round a bend. The trees thin out. A narrow stone lane appears ahead, one you vaguely recognize. It leads home, not just in a physical sense, but in the way all long walks do, where the return feels earned. Because now, Home is not the same place you left. Not because it's changed, but because you have. You step onto the lane. The sound shifts slightly under your boots, less mud, more gravel. The mist curls back like it's giving you space. The rain has gentle again, almost reverent, like a bow at the end of a long performance. You've passed through something. It's hard to name, but you know it. And maybe that's enough. You reach a small wooden sign, half faded but still legible. It reads, "Return with less than you carried." You touch it gently as you pass, as if to say thank you. This was the final idea behind the Victorian rain prescriptions, not just to soothe, or distract, or exercise, but to relieve. To set things down in the weather. Let the rain wash a bit of your burden into the soil and take root as something gentler. You can feel it already. The mental noise? Quieter. The guilt? Softer. The panic? Not gone, but tamed. One last puddle, right at the base of your garden gate. You step in it deliberately, let it splash your ankles, just to prove you're still not afraid of getting wetter. And then you push open the gate, slowly, reverently, as if re-entering something sacred. And you are. It's not a palace. It's not pristine. But it's dryish. And it smells faintly of old books and clean laundry and safety. You close the door behind you, peel off your soaked layers, and sit with the weight of the day still humming in your bones. But it's a good weight. The kind that says, you moved. You felt. You didn't run away. You walked through it. And tomorrow, if the clouds come back? So what? You know how to meet them now. Boots on. Head high. Heart open. Feet steady. Step by soaked, peaceful step. So now, your coat is hanging to dry. Your boots are by the door. The weather is still whispering outside, soft and unhurried. And inside, everything feels just a little quieter. Let the stillness settle in your chest. Not in a dramatic way. Just as a slow hush, like fog rolling over hills. Like breath deepening. Like the soft creak of wood as your house settles in for the night. You've done enough today. You've walked through miles of rain and time, not to chase answers, but to let questions dissolve. To let your shoulders lower. To let your body remember that you can move without urgency. That you are not a machine. You're something older. Slower. Gentler. And now, as the lights dim and your breathing slows, imagine that trail again, the one with the mossy stones and bowed trees and puddles deep enough to drown yesterday's stress. It's still out there. Still waiting. And any time you need it, you can go back. Even if only in your mind. Even if only through the sound of the rain on your roof. You are not broken. You're just human. And tonight, that's more than enough. So rest now. Let your thoughts go quiet. Let the weather tuck you in. Let the rain sing you to sleep.